right, well, let's get this show going here. Welcome everybody, and pull up your cup of coffee. In my case, it's some cream brulee from the County Door Coffee Company, or whatever else you may be drinking, along with your project. And join us for the next couple of hours here of modeling. And today we're focused on coloring signs. So today's focus is going to be on weathering signs. This is installment 2 out of the 3 installments on signs. I decided to really break out the signs because they're really important in the whole story on the structure. So today we're going to focus on weathering the signs, and we're going to show you a few different tricks and a few different methodologies of coloring signs. And to begin with, I'm going to bring in Greg Cassidy. Now, Greg has a lot of experience with doing things online here. He has his own channel, which is very well done. But I'm going to go on ahead and turn this over to Greg and let him do a live demo on coloring some signs for you, and then I'll come back and offer an alternative. So Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Let me point out to you guys, I've done a lot of stuff online, but this is my first actual live demonstration. So we'll see what happens. What I'm going to show you is how I end up rusting signs. And because we're rusting them, what we're talking about today are metal signs. Obviously, there's all kinds of signs that you can put on your models. You can have painted on signs, and I know that's going to be a future topic. And you can have billboards and other signs that are painted on wood. The signs I'm going to be showing today are the metal signs that typically had been put on buildings for the last century. And I guess if nobody has any questions, we can go ahead and switch it over to my phone, and I will start showing you what I do. So I usually start with a number of printouts, and what I print out really depends on the building I'm going to be working on. If it's a gas station, I'll go for gas station signs. A general store, I'll try more general produce signs. And some kits come with signs in them, and sometimes I'll use them, but it really depends on if they're printed very well. I've gotten some kits where the printing of the signs is really poor quality, even if it's a great kit, or they may not be a sign that I particularly wanted on my building. I've sometimes made signs for my buildings, but once I print them out, I'll usually scale them to what size I want. And if it's going to be a metal sign that is going to be mounted on a building, I usually want it a little bit thicker than the standard bond that I print on. So one of the techniques that I'll do is, as shown with this, I'll take a second piece of paper, just cut it roughly the same size, and use some Elmer's glue, just spread it on the back, and that way it gives me 2 thicknesses of the bond. And in most cases, I've found that that holds up so that once you glue it onto clapboard or board and batten or something like that, it'll hold its shape the way a metal sign would. You can use cardboard, but I've found sometimes that ends up being too thick, unless you're trying to show a sign that's actually mounted on a wood backing or something. And if you just use a single sheet of paper, it does run the risk of maybe curling where it's not actually glued to the siding, you know, if you have clapboard or something. So I like going with 2 sheets of paper, and it's just what tends to work for me. Once I have it glued together, And I didn't with these because I'm just going to show the demonstration. I'll decide if I want to do the rusting and the weathering of the signs on the sheet of paper, or if I want to cut it out first. I always find it easier to do it on the sheet of paper if I can, but sometimes I won't. If I have a printout like this, and if I wanted to rust this sign, but I want to save a couple others for some other time, then I'm more likely to cut it out first. But on a sheet like this, where I have a lot of room around the signs, I can go ahead and rust those in place. So once I pick the sign I'm going to work on, and we'll go ahead and take this Sinclair sign right here. I usually pick a couple of colors. For most of the rusting, I'll just use craft paints, and I tend to use burnt umber, burnt sienna, and raw umber. They give me a dark and a medium and a light. Sometimes I'll use a type of Vallejo paint, or for some rusting effects, I'll use an AK. The hull red and saddle brown are really good together. They give a kind of a dark rust and a light rust. But mostly for signs, if I'm going to be using a sponging on technique, I'll stick with my craft paints. I know what shades I'm going to get and how I'm going to use them. So I'll first start with the lighter color, which is going to be burnt sienna. And I'll put a little dab on a palette. Now, I tend to use old coffee lids for palettes. I also use them for glue palettes. And then I have a bundle of sponges here. Now, these are all just cut from one of those large grout sponges that you can get at Home Depot. I do have some what are called artist sponges as well, which are pretty similar. And then I've also got in there some natural sponge and stuff. Mostly what you're going for is something that has a whole bunch of little imperfections in it. And that's why I'll take one of these and tear it apart. And you're trying to get where you have a lot of those imperfections. Those are what you're going after. And here's why. I've seen some people use tweezers to do this. I just roll it up in my finger so that I've got a little bit of a ball with all the imperfections out like that. I'll dip it in my color. And then just like dry brushing, I'll try to unload most of the paint off of it. What I'm going for is where I finally get it to where I'm getting tiny little impressions. And then that's what I'll start applying to the sign. Now, for my light colors, I usually tend to go over the whole sign, and that gives just a sort of impression of a background rust on the entire sign. Then I'll move on to one of my darker colors. I'll put a little bit in the palette. And if I've unloaded my sponge, then I can use the same one. Sometimes if I've used it a couple of times, I'll move on to a new one. And again, I've just got the dark color on there, and I'll tap most of it off. And the dark colors, I'll start going around the outer edges of it, where you might get some more rust building up. Rust on signs usually tends to move from the outside in as the enamel paint kind of wears away. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have big rust spots here and there. But for most of my signs, that's how I'll tend to do it. And then if I want to, and especially if it's a larger sign, I'll use one of my darkest browns. In this case, it's raw umber. And I'll try to get a really fine point of paint on it, and then unload all of that. And maybe try and hit one or two spots where it's just a little more rusty there for some reason. It might be on the edge, or on a bigger sign, it might be on part of the sign. And then this is what it'll come out looking like. Let me turn it right side up there. And something like that. Now, I can show you here what doing that same technique did on this sign on this kit. And that Sinclair sign right there, I did the same way. Now, once I've got it rusted to the point I want it, I'll go ahead and cut it out. You can use a new X-Acto blade for that. You want to use something sharp. I got turned on to these scalpels, and when I'm going to be doing something where I need a really sharp blade, that's what I'll end up using. And depending on the sign, I'll very often use a straight edge if I have a lot of straight corners that I need to go to and from. But on a sign like this, where we've got a lot of bends, I can sometimes feel comfortable cutting it out freehand. And again, it depends on the size of the sign you're doing and the border on the sign. So once I have it cut out, and typically this would be mounted on a separate sheet of bond so that it would have twice its thickness. One of the things that really stands out real easily on a sign like this, once it's mounted on a building, is a white edge. And I have two different ways that I deal with that. A quick and easy way is to use some type of marker. You could use a Sharpie, or there are some other types of markers. And if you go along the edge, it'll hide that white edge. And let me see if I can show that. One of the cautions I'm going to give is sometimes, depending on the bond you're using, this can actually bleed into the sign. And you might see that. Sometimes I'll use a brown one. That gives the appearance that the edge is actually rusting. So one of the other things that I'll sometimes do, if I want to make sure I avoid that, is I'll just use a little bit of black craft paint. Actually, for this, I usually just, after shaking it, unscrew the cap. And then I'll get a very fine paintbrush. In this case, it's a 20-0. And put a little bit on, and I'll just go right along the edge. And I always make sure I'm doing it from the back of the sign, because if your brush slips, it'll be marking the back and not the front of the sign. And this is a little more tedious, but it removes the risk of anything bleeding onto the sign that the marker gives you. And then when I go to attach my signs, in a case like a building like this, I'll just tend to use canopy glue, something like that. A white Elmer's glue would tend to work. And you don't need to get it very wet. You don't want it to kind of warp or wrinkle or anything like that. But these are all just signs that I did that same rusting effect on. And then once I get them mounted, I'll do some more rust appearance to them in relation to the wall. And I think that's something we're going to talk about later. So I think that's it for my demonstration. Are there any questions about anything that I've done? You know, it's not a new technique. I've learned it from watching YouTube's Jason Jensen and some other people. It's a fairly simple technique, and it's very similar to the type of sponging you can do for weathering wood. Basically, you're just trying to get the sponge to where you're using a lot of those little irregularities for putting lots of tiny little spots and impressions on the sign. So I guess that's it, Chris.
Okay, well, outstanding. Thank you very much for participating here on this. It's a little bit different, as you noticed, from a pre-recording to doing it live, but the big thing is to go on ahead and enjoy the process. Does anybody, again, have any questions on Greg's technique here or anything?
And I'll be here all night, so.
Okay.
I have one question, Chris. I
Uh-huh.
noticed Greg said he used the Elmer's glue, but he didn't say anything that it was rubber cement. It's rubber cement glue that he uses.
Oh, yes, for attaching the 2 sheets of paper together.
Yes.
Yes, it's Elmer's rubber cement. Now, any contact cement will work. I have another bottle of contact cement that I've also used. I think it was DAP, and I just ran out of it. But basically, a paper contact cement is all I use.
So regular glue won't work very well, is what you're saying.
I think it introduces more than you need because regular glue has more moisture in it, and the rubber cement, contact cement, it basically doesn't introduce any moisture into the paper.
Okay. Yep. Good. Thank you.
Helps prevent the bleeding from the backside of the
Right on.
ink. Yeah. So, which I know Pat is familiar with, so he's a very advanced modeler here.
Oh, now.
So anyway, all right. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of a variation on what was just shown by Greg here. You know, in modeling, there's 88 different ways to skin the cat.
Yep.
And so, again, I wanted to go back and note that these are the kind of metal signs. If you go back to last week's show, we